Imagine a country with almost nothing left. No powerful economy, no huge natural resources, and millions of people trying to survive after a devastating war. Now look at South Korea today. Skyscrapers filling the Seoul skyline. Samsung and Hyundai competing with the biggest companies on Earth. Korean music, movies, and technology reaching almost every corner of the world. But how did this happen? How did one of the world's poorest countries transform itself into a global economic and cultural powerhouse? The answer is a story of war, sacrifice, education, risk, and one extraordinary decision that changed everything. This is the story of South Korea's incredible rise. Imagine waking up in a country where almost everything around you has been destroyed. The roads are damaged, factories are barely operating, families have been separated, and for millions of ordinary people, the future looks almost impossible to imagine. This was South Korea in the years after the Korean War. When the fighting finally ended in 1953, South Korea was left facing enormous problems. The country was poor, its infrastructure was badly damaged, and there was very little industrial power to support a modern economy. And unlike some wealthy countries, South Korea couldn't simply depend on natural resources to become rich. There were no enormous oil reserves waiting underground, no massive supply of valuable minerals that could instantly transform the economy. So South Korea had a difficult question to answer. If we don't have natural wealth, what do we have? The answer was simple: people. And that idea would become one of the most important parts of South Korea's transformation. The country began putting enormous importance on education, discipline, infrastructure, and industrial development. Parents pushed their children toward education because they believed knowledge could give the next generation opportunities they never had. At the same time, the government began building roads, ports, factories, and power systems that could support a modern economy. But none of this happened overnight. For ordinary South Koreans, the transformation meant sacrifice, long working hours, limited resources, and years of believing that the difficult work they were doing today could create a better life tomorrow. Slowly, the country began changing. Factories started producing more, workers became more skilled, exports began growing, and Korean companies started learning how to compete in international markets. South Korea was still far from being rich, but something important had changed. The country was no longer simply trying to survive, it was beginning to build. And then South Korea made a huge gamble. A gamble that would push the country toward rapid industrialization, but could also have destroyed its fragile economy. That decision would change South Korea forever. South Korea had a problem. It wanted to become an industrial country, but it didn't have enough money to build the economy it dreamed of. So the country took a huge risk. Instead of waiting for wealth to appear, South Korea began investing in industries that could sell products to the rest of the world. Roads were built, ports were expanded, factories were developed, and businesses were encouraged to produce goods for international markets. The goal was simple: make products in South Korea and sell them around the world. But there was a catch. South Korea had to compete against countries that were already far more developed. So the country couldn't afford to stay focused only on cheap products. It needed better workers, better technology, and better companies. This is where education became incredibly important. More schools and universities were developed, and millions of young people entered a rapidly changing workforce. Generation by generation, South Korea was building something that money alone couldn't buy: a highly skilled population. And slowly, Korean companies started becoming more ambitious. They weren't satisfied with simply making products for other countries. They wanted to create their own global brands. That ambition would eventually produce companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. But before these companies became household names, South Korea had to survive one of the most difficult periods of its economic transformation. And the country was about to discover that becoming an industrial power would require an enormous sacrifice. South Korea knew that building factories wasn't enough. The country needed companies that could compete with the biggest businesses in the world. And slowly, Korean companies began taking that challenge seriously. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG started expanding beyond the Korean market. At first, many Korean products competed mainly because they were affordable, but the goal was never to stay cheap. The companies began investing more in quality, engineering, research, and technology. Hyundai pushed into the global automobile market. Samsung moved deeper into electronics and semiconductors. LG became a major name in consumer electronics. And something important was happening behind the scenes. These companies were learning how to compete internationally. They were learning how to manufacture at huge scale, improve products quickly, and build brands that people outside South Korea could trust. But South Korea's biggest advantage wasn't just its companies. It was the people working inside them. A highly educated and increasingly skilled workforce gave Korean businesses the ability to move from basic manufacturing into more advanced industries. And then came the moment that changed everything. South Korea stopped trying to simply follow the world's leading economies and started trying to catch them. But catching up wouldn't be easy. The next step would require something far more powerful than cheap labor: technology. By the 1990s, South Korea realized something important. The future wouldn't belong to the countries with the most factories. It would belong to the countries with the best technology. So billions of dollars were invested into research, innovation, and high-speed internet. While many nations were still building basic digital infrastructure, South Korea was already preparing for the next generation. Universities worked closely with technology companies. Young engineers created new ideas, and businesses competed to build faster, smarter, and more reliable products. Soon, Samsung became one of the world's biggest electronics companies. Hyundai challenged global car manufacturers. LG entered millions of homes across the planet. South Korea was no longer copying the world had started copying South Korea. But technology wasn't the only thing making the country famous. A completely different revolution was about to begin: the Korean Wave. At the same time, Korean movies won international awards, and Korean culture became a global phenomenon. This movement became known as Hallyu, the Korean Wave. And something incredible happened. People who first discovered South Korea through music and dramas became interested in its food, fashion, language, and technology. South Korea wasn't just exporting products anymore, it was exporting its culture, and that gave the country something even more valuable than money: global influence. But behind all this success, South Korea was still facing one difficult challenge that could shape its future forever. Today, South Korea has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, which means fewer young people are entering the workforce each year. The country also faces rising housing prices, intense academic pressure, and one of the most competitive work cultures on Earth. Success came with opportunities, but it also came with pressure. Even so, South Korea continues investing in artificial intelligence, robotics, electric vehicles, and semiconductor technology. Its goal is no longer just to catch up with the world's biggest economies. It's to lead the future, and that's what makes South Korea's journey so inspiring. Because this isn't simply the story of a rich country, it's the story of a nation that refused to let its past decide its future. South Korea's story proves something incredible. A country doesn't need endless natural resources to become powerful. It needs vision, education, discipline, and people who refuse to give up. From the ruins of war to the skyscrapers of Seoul, from poverty to becoming home to global giants like Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and one of the world's strongest technology industries, South Korea changed its destiny. Today, millions of people admire its innovation, its culture, and its economic success. But behind every success story lies decades of sacrifice, hard work, and bold decisions. And that's the real secret behind South Korea's rise. If you enjoyed this documentary, hit the like button, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to Supreme Documentaries for more incredible stories from around the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.